So for this week's podcast, I want to focus on the optimal roster management for the Minnesota Vikings heading into 2020. We'll start with the defense first, since that's where most of the damage is going to be done anyway this upcoming offseason. For me, the core players that the Vikings should be focused on the defensive side of the ball. And when I say core players, I'm talking about players that command a significant cap space but are worth keeping and building around for the foreseeable future. Danielle Hunter, Eric Kendricks, and Anthony Harris. Those are the three guys that the Vikings should build around for the foreseeable future. Now, obviously, Hunter and Kendricks, they're already locked in long-term contracts. Anthony Harris, he's a free agent. We'll talk about that in just a second. Anybody outside of that is fair game for possible roster changes. You disagree with me, go ahead and leave your comments below this video. We'll start with the defensive line. Danielle Hunter, he can move to right end, and I believe the Vikings have a plethora of options to work with at left end, whether that's Stephen Weatherly and or Ifeadi Odenigbo. Either way, I believe the Vikings, they can afford to move on from Everson Griffen and his $13.9 million cap hit. Now, personally, I would have moved on from Everson Griffen last offseason. Not to say that he's not still a great player. He can still play at a high level, but it just doesn't make sense business-wise to keep him heading into next season. Then we move on to the interior defensive line, where both starting defensive tackles struggled in 2019. There were too many instances where I said to myself, where's the interior pressure? Now, Linval Joseph, he commands a $13 million cap hit in 2020. Shamar Stephen, $5 million. And I think you've got some replacement options in-house, starting with Jaleel Johnson, Jalen Holmes. Armon Watts, he played pretty well in 2019. So, with these proposed moves on the defensive line, moving on from Everson Griffen, Linval Joseph, Shamar Stephen, you take about just under a $6 million dead cap hit. At the same time, you'd free up about $26 million in cap space. So that's a win for me right there. Then we move on to linebackers. I'm good with Eric Kendricks. He's a core player. At the same time, I would trade Anthony Barr. Anthony Barr is not worth $12.7 million against the cap. I would trade him to some other team who thinks he's great and get a decent return for him. And I understand that if you trade Anthony Barr, he would count $10.4 million in dead cap against the Vikings. At the same time, you would free up by trading Anthony Barr $2.3 million in cap space, which is a win for me. And I don't want to hear a damn thing about, oh my God, you cannot trade away a player or release a player who counts that much against the cap in dead cap money, because I don't give a damn. He has no impact on the field. And I've been saying this for years, only to be opposed by analytic horseshit by these Anthony Barr apologists. Well, you don't understand the nuances and the adjusted efficiency pressure rate and the adjusted per coverage snap and the hell up out of here. Anthony Barr is the most overrated player in the history of this franchise. Replace him with Eric Wilson, who is a restricted free agent, so you have some leverage there, and you won't notice the difference at all. Now, we'll move on to the cornerback group. We'll start with the obvious. You'll cut Xavier Rhodes. Now, you'll take a dead cap hit of about $4.8 million. At the same time, you'll save about $8.1 million in cap space. So the cornerback group for the Minnesota Vikings is the one position group this upcoming offseason that's in the most dire need for upgrading. And I know that the offensive line, they have their needs as well, but it really doesn't compare to what's needed with the cornerbacks, because what they're left with right now, Holton Hill, who all I'm asking for out of Holton Hill, and I think this is fair, is to not get suspended. Can you do that for me, bro? Next, you've got Mike Hughes, who's recovering from a freaking broken vertebrae. Hopefully, he's able to return healthy in 2020. Even when he was healthy this 2019 season, he wasn't really nothing to raise hell about. And lastly, you've got Chris Boyd, who there's something there, but he still has a lot to prove. Now, as far as potential free agency options, you could look to bring back Trey Waynes. There's Darqueze Dennard from Cincinnati. Or you could maybe take a chance on 31-year-old Chris Harris. I have no idea. Obviously, you have the draft to work with as well. But I think the cornerback group for the Minnesota Vikings has more questions than answers at this point in time. And lastly, you've got safety. So this is a no-brainer, but Anthony Harris, he has to be the number one priority for the Vikings in free agency. And so I mentioned my core players on defense, Danielle Hunter, Eric Kendricks, and Anthony Harris. And some of you guys may be saying to yourselves, aren't you forgetting somebody? What about Hitman? What about Harrison Smith? And I'm going to be honest with you, folks. I'm not saying that I would outright do this, but I would at least gauge the trade market for Harrison Smith because he's going to be 31, pushing 32. He's still a great player, but he's on the decline. We can't ignore that fact. And the biggest reason that I'm even bringing this up is because I would take a chance on Jaron Kearse. I think Jaron Kearse has shown enough so far through his athleticism and playmaking ability that this man can play starting safety in this league at a high level. He's 25 years old, and yes, he's an unrestricted free agent, but you can bring this man back at an extremely team-friendly contract, nothing close to the $10.75 million cap hit of Hitman Harrison Smith. So with these proposed moves on defense, the Vikings would go from what they're starting at right now at over $10 million over the cap to $35.5 million in cap space. What's there to talk about? Now, Harrison Smith, you want to argue about that? Go ahead and do that in the comment section. Now we get on offense where, for the most part, I think you would leave well enough alone. However, I would bench Pat Elflein. I don't think there's anything left to see here. He's on his rookie deal, so I understand why you wouldn't want to cut him. But at this point, at best, he's a backup guard. Now, with that said, there is a guy out there. Now, Drew Samia, maybe he can be ready to go in 2020. Best case scenario, there is a free agent out there by the name of Brandon Scherff, who from the Washington Redskins, who's played right guard his whole career in the NFL. So I would take a chance on him, bring him in. That would be an instant upgrade, but he will play right guard. And I would take a chance at moving Josh Klein to left guard, who's played left guard or at least a mix of left guard for the first 4 years of his career. Then at left tackle, you have a couple of options to replace Riley Reiff. There's Anthony Costanzo from Indianapolis, but assuming you can't get him, let's say they bring him back, that he returns to Indy, you could consider maybe moving Brian O'Neill from right tackle to left tackle. And I know that's a huge risk. I'm not saying that the Vikings should just straight up do it, but if you feel good about that, there's Jack Conklin out there from Tennessee who could play right tackle, or worst case scenario, if you move Brian O'Neill to left tackle, you could bring back Rashad Hill on the cheap to play right tackle. Now we move on to Dalvin Cook, where this is a tricky one because he plays running back and he has shown you nothing up to this point in his 3-year career that he's durable. So we understand that. However, when healthy, he's one of the best running backs in the league. And there's also the Kirk Cousins effect. Without Dalvin Cook, especially going up against good teams, Kirk Cousins, he's not going to be effective. He's really, really not. You need Dalvin Cook with the play action. Or if you think Alexander Mattison can take over, okay, fine. I don't think Alexander Mattison can fill the shoes of Dalvin Cook. So on the totem pole, he's probably last. I want Dalvin Cook to come back. But I understand that he's probably last in the priority list, but that's a tough one. I'm not going to fault the Vikings either way, whether they move on or keep Dalvin Cook. But I'm just telling you this. If you're going to keep Kirk Cousins long-term, you have to have Dalvin Cook. And there's not too many running backs like him. I understand that running backs, they're a dime a dozen, but there aren't too many running backs like a Saquon Barkley, an Ezekiel Elliott, or a Dalvin Cook. So that's just me. Now, with all of those moves, now I talked about the defensive moves and the cap space, $35.5 million in cap space that the Vikings would have. However, if the Vikings are able to move on from Riley Reiff and they have other options to work with, they would have $44 million in cap space. So you would go from being over $10 million against the cap to having $44 million in cap space. That's a hell of a lot to work with. We do this now during the off season, once a week. Mediocre Best Sports Podcast with Realistic Randy. Check me out on Twitter at realistic_Randy, Facebook at Realistic Randy. Next podcast will be next week. We'll see you then.